childhood is a time in which you can change the individual into something that is more desirable for whoever is in power. It did become very difficult for San parents to look after their children, right? Because you're dispossessed of your land, you're living a very precarious existence, you are kind of actively hated, and there's kind of efforts to eradicate you. You don't have access to the same sort of natural resources, food supplies, water supplies that perhaps previous generations had. So these circumstances were created by settler colonialism, but then were in turn used as a justification for removing San children because, their parents can't look after them, so it's better that they then become kind of indentured laborers in settler households. When children are removed from their communities deliberately and for sustained periods of time, the intention there is to create a cultural rupture, a cultural break, essentially, because you're trying to make these children into something else. What they were was problematic and not desirable in terms of the colonial apparatus. Sometimes what current political leaders are saying doesn't hold water when you actually look at the history. What they're doing could be possibly quite divisive, and then we could kind of learn histories of the past where these things have been attempted in the past. As soon as someone, for me, as soon as a politician starts talking about a pure race, I sort of check out, because that's a flawed idea, right? And it's been used time and time again to cause so much havoc in so many parts of the world. So that immediately for me is a red flag. As soon as people talk about things like, well, to use a phrase we hear quite often these days in the news at least, like make America great again, right? Yeah. It's this harking back to this imagined past where everything was perfect, and then, we allowed immigrants in and now everything's gone bad, That's deeply problematic. That's a red flag.
Good morning, Mzansi, and welcome to the Social Justice Lab, where it may seem like it's about a lot of things, but we assure you, it's just society. We're joined in studio today by the man, the myth, the legend, Dr. Jared McDonald. We're honored to have Dr. Jared McDonald from the University of the Free State with us. Dr. McDonald is a distinguished historian with a PhD from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. He serves as the Chief of Staff to the Rector and Vice Chancellor, and previously he served as the Assistant Dean of the Faculty of Humanities on the Khoi campus. His research focuses include the role of the London Missionary Society in Southern Africa, settler colonialism, and the comparative histories of children as victims of genocide. His most recent monograph, Khoesan and Imperial Citizenship in the 19th-Century South Africa, was published in 2023. Dr. McDonald is also deeply involved in the scholarship of teaching and learning, having published extensively and received numerous awards in this area. Thank you for joining us in the Social Justice Lab, Dr. McDonald.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Could you provide us with an overview of the current status and location of Cape San communities? How have their living conditions and cultural practices evolved over time?
So that's a very deep question. It's a question that goes back into the deep past of our country's history, of course, and before. And it's a history that has been marked by waves of dispossession and marginalization, which sadly in many ways is still a reality for a lot of Khoesan communities and descendants in South Africa and Southern Africa. I like to kind of just note that when engaging in these sorts of discussions from the outset is that, of course, I come to this as an outsider. But I come to it as someone who, adheres to the highest standards of scholarly research. So I recognize that I have a privileged position in that I've been able to spend time in archives in different parts of the world, working through materials that kind of bring to light the history of the Khoesan peoples. And so I'm really here as someone who takes this research very seriously, comes at it in a way where I want to tell the history in a responsible manner, but I do, of course, recognize my positionality in all of that. But in response directly to the question, the Khoesan are the kind of original indigenous peoples of Southern Africa, of what in time becomes South Africa, of course. They're also the first peoples to encounter kind of sustained European colonialism and settler colonialism. And as I said, that has brought about kind of waves of dispossession, marginalization, deprivation, and in some instances, of course, as well, processes of genocide. And those legacies run deep and are sadly, as I noted, still very much with us today. And I think one would probably, from just watching the media, maybe kind of reading stories online, pick up that there's a deep sense of dissatisfaction, I think, amongst Khoesan communities and Khoesan descended communities of their place and status in modern South Africa and in democratic South Africa, and that perhaps to some extent, the dreams and promises of a democratic South Africa haven't delivered in ways that they almost certainly would have hoped, and that they remain kind of on the margins and on the sidelines of the South African story post 1994.
Yeah, your reference to the dissatisfaction of the Khoesan communities sort of takes me to the notion of loyalism, which existed in the 19th century during the colonial era.
Right.
And how the Khoesan community sort of saw loyalism as a way to integrate themselves into, colonial society and colonial citizenship. I think that ties very well into the point you just made.
Right, yeah.
Please tell us about loyalism and how it came to shape Khoesan relations.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I think the link you're making between the past and the present is very pertinent. So what I explore in my book that you mentioned in your very kind introduction is how Khoesan peoples were essentially incorporated as colonial subjects into the British Empire, which in the early 19th century is really kind of expanding at quite a rapid rate. And I came at this research from the perspective of, I didn't want to see history as something that happened to the Khoesan, but the Khoesan as being active participants in the unfolding of their own history. And so one of the questions that kind of motivated me was, how did Khoesan experience imperialism? How did they experience settler colonialism? With those two things, of course, being quite different. Bearing in mind that the Cape Colony and its kind of frontier hinterlands was a settler colony before it became a British Empire. And so you have these kind of different sort of settler regimes that are interconnecting and intersecting, and what were the consequences for Khoesan and how did they respond? And as you indicated, one of the things that emerges that is quite fascinating is the way in which Khoesan tried to play the hand that they were dealt, tried to deal with circumstances that weren't of their choosing, in ways that reflect, kind of quite a strong sense of identity, a strong sense of agency, and sometimes that manifested in physical acts of resistance, which may have been kind of violent, for instance, confrontational, but resistance to colonialism wasn't always and only confrontational or necessarily violent. It did take other forms as well. And so one of the themes that I try to highlight in the book is the way in which some Khoesan, for instance, used colonial law as a means to try and improve their circumstances or try and fend off the worst excesses of settler colonialism. And that's quite interesting because it shows resistance from within the parameters of the colonial state. But it gives us a sense of, these are real people living at a time. They don't have the benefit of hindsight like we now have. So you're in a context and you're trying to kind of respond to the circumstances you find yourself in. And yes, they're in a deeply oppressive situation, but at the same time they're able to kind of react and to resist, and sometimes in ways that are quite unexpected, I think, for us sort of looking back, you know. And I think, as I said, that just speaks to a strong sense of identity, a strong sense of agency, and that's something that I wanted to highlight, especially in the book. And like you say, you know, it draws into the present and possibly the future. There's, of course, the kind of the cliche observation that we learn from the past, we learn the lessons of the past, and the past has this tendency of sort of repeating itself, at least at surface level. But I think it speaks to the present moment in that there is, as we've said, this kind of discontent amongst Khoesan and Khoesan descendants, and how are they going to kind of grapple with that and deal with that and exercise agency and exercise their sense of self in dealing with circumstances that, again, are not necessarily of their choosing.
Yeah. That the point you're making of dealing with circumstances that are not of their choosing, it's sort of also highlighted in the book, where you sort of highlight that colonialism wasn't a one-way affair. You know, it was not monolithic, I think is the word you used. But
right, yeah.
It was definitely like a sense of agency that the colonized or the subjugated exercise also shaped the colonial dynamics.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it was an exchange. Of course, one has to recognize the power dynamics that are at play, and colonialism ultimately was about power, right, and the imposition of power, and with that, the imposition of ways of control on people. So we recognize that, and I think the work that we do to try and kind of reveal some of the complexities of that in no way diminishes that, right? But in picking out some of those complexities, you get a greater sense of the colonized and the colonized's experience, such that you don't tell the history of colonialism only from the vantage point of the colonizer. And one of the ideas that I sort of had playing in my mind when in the very early stages of doing the research for this book was the notion that colonialism in effect inadvertently brought with it the tools of its own undoing, because people are not going to remain oppressed forever, right? It's kind of a natural human inclination to resist oppression. And that resistance can take multiple forms, as I indicated. Sometimes it's confrontational, sometimes it results in conflict, open conflict, which sadly can become, of course, violent, and can result in the loss of life and so on. But other times it can take other forms. And you noted at the beginning in your introduction that some of the work I've done has also been on the role of the London Missionary Society in South Africa. And maybe if I could just touch on that briefly, because it relates to this point, is, around the late 18th century through to the mid-19th century, there were sort of just thousands of missionaries that kind of came out of Europe, predominantly Western Europe, and kind of spread all over the world, kind of believing that they had a calling to spread the gospel. And they of course had an influence wherever they went, and sometimes those influences were very negative, of course. And there's been a lot of scholarship on the displacement of cultural beliefs and so on through the introduction of Christianity. But in the Cape context, what the research has shown is that a lot of the missionaries were motivated by this belief that the individual needed to have a personal relationship with God. That was sort of their kind of framing, and the way in which that could be facilitated or should be facilitated was through the individual reading scriptures, right, reading the Bible. And so in order to enable that, the missionaries start to introduce schooling so that they can teach literacy. And the intention was that so that their congregants could read the Bible. But of course, what happens as well is once you're literate, the terrain shifts, right? The social terrain shifts, the political terrain shifts. And so if you're literate, you can read scripture, but you can also read colonial newspapers, for instance. You can also start to write things like petitions, And so it underpins the emergence of quite a vibrant Khoesan political consciousness, in fact, which was kind of an unintended consequence, right, of the introduction of Christianity and the work that the missionaries were doing. And this is why I find history so fascinating, right? It's all the kind of unintended consequences, and when one digs into those, you just realize that the past is so much more complex than we've sometimes realized or appreciated. But literacy proved to be a tool through which and by which Khoesan could resist. And for me, that's quite fascinating. Like, as I've mentioned, also using colonial law. So something that inherently was part of the oppressive regime of colonialism, but there's these kind of little cracks in the system, these idiosyncrasies, these contradictions within the system that open up spaces for resistance in ways that may not have been anticipated by the colonizers. And that's really what has interested me and inspired me in a lot of this sort of work.
Yeah, speaking on that, I remember you mentioned, I think it's the Chaldean Code or Chaldean Code 60, and I think that speaks to some of the things you're mentioning there.
If I could just mention that code just briefly, I mean, it's because, of course, one of the most hated laws of apartheid, and rightfully so, were the pass laws, right? Where black South Africans, colored South Africans, Indian South Africans couldn't move through certain places without having a pass to give them permission to be there. And those laws came into effect in sort of the 1950s, following the coming to power of the National Party on its platform of apartheid. But there's these historical precursors that go way back. So the Caledon Code, which was a British colonial law passed in 1809, enforced a system of passes for Khoesan in the Cape Colony. So if you were a Khoesan individual living in the Cape, you had to have a pass to basically give you permission to be where you were at any particular time. And if you were kind of stopped on your way and asked to produce the pass and you couldn't produce it, you could sort of be arrested on the spot for being a vagrant and that sort of thing. But at the same time, what the Caledon Code also did is it actually insisted that Khoesan laborers working for, say, settler colonial farmers had to have contracts of employment. And those contracts had to stipulate for how long they would be employed and what the conditions of their employment were. What would the remuneration be? That was a big one, right? Because most Khoesan, while they may have endured conditions that were oftentimes similar to slavery, that they were not technically slaves, at least in theory, right? So they needed to be remunerated for whatever labor they performed. And this Caledon Code tries to sort of enforce that. So there's elements of it that are deeply oppressive, and we see how that continues even beyond the 19th century, well into the 20th century, and manifests in apartheid. But at the same time, it also introduces kind of a stricter labor framework that gives Khoesan servants greater leverage to try and improve their circumstances.
Yeah. Sort of going back to your example of literacy and all that. Sort of to paint the context for the audience of what was going on in the Cape during that time, the Dutch settlers were farmers. Would go on periodic killing sprees where they'd exterminate San and other indigenous populations in order to get land, and they would take the children into the San children into their service because of the prospects for indoctrination, so to speak, and kids are more open to being convinced and all of that. And when the British imperial government came, when the British imperialists arrived, they sort of decided that they would put limitations on that practice, and it didn't go well with Dutch settlers. So I was sort of reading that a while ago, and I sort of had this idea of, it's almost like we're in a high school yard, and you're bullying me, right? And you're my bully and everything. And then one day, a new bully comes to school now, and now it's sort of awkward for you and I. Our bullying relationship is sort of awkward because now this guy is bullying both of us.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. And it's an important point because that's why just as the colonized were not homogenous and not monolithic. Culturally, socially, in terms of how they responded to colonialism, in South African history, at least, the colonizing kind of forces were not homogenous either, and there were deep issues of resentment and distrust between a lot of the Dutch settlers and their descendants, and the British imperial government once Britain takes possession of the Cape. First in 1795 for a time, and then more permanently from 1806, and it's something we have to keep sight of because at that time the British imperial government kind of saw what it was doing as this sort of grand project of saving indigenous peoples, kind of from themselves, right? The civilizing mission, and a lot of the kind of imperial project had these rather weird. Kind of humanitarian underpinnings, A lot of it was motivated by the anti-slavery campaign, which was happening kind of simultaneously as well. But again, these deep sort of contradictions that are unfolding, but that create these spaces for the colonized to respond and to resist in ways that, as I said, that we might not have always predicted or expected, but coming to your point about the San in particular, and their history, it was really an historian at UCT who's been one of my mentors. It's a professor by the name of Muhammad Adakari, who brought the genocide of the San to light. It was about sort of, I'm thinking now, probably about 15 years ago when he published a book on this. And it wasn't the first book on the topic, but he sort of reignited the whole debate around, had the San been subjected to genocide? And we know genocide is a very specific thing in terms of how it's defined. It's a deliberate, intentional effort to try and eradicate a group of people. But I think since then, the idea has started to gain more traction because more research has been done that has kind of reinforced the argument that yes, indeed, San were at different times and in different parts of the subcontinent subjected to processes that we can describe as being genocidal, that there was a kind of an intent to wipe them out. But in many instances that was because as you noted, there was a kind of a thirst for land, right? And so you have to, it's kind of a classic settler colonial process. You dispossess the people who are living on the land so that you can then acquire the land. And this unfolded, during the course of the 1700s and well into the 1800s. But what was also true of the San experience was that these farmers who kind of set up these cattle farms, in these rather sort of underdeveloped, quite arid conditions deep into the interior, they needed labor. So now, how do you acquire labor if the only labor that's really available to you, you're eradicating and wiping out? And that's where indigenous children then became sort of prized as exactly that. So, and as you indicated, children by their nature are more easily controlled, more easily molded into something that is more desirable for the colonial state than an adult who is probably going to be more likely to resist, may be literate and so have an understanding of the laws that apply to them and the kind of the rights that they have even within a colonial context, and so I've written some pieces on the forced removal of San children as part of this process. But I mean, the sad reality there is that that's something that has occurred time and time again across the world. I think people would probably be most familiar with the history of Australia, right, and the stolen generations, and what happened with Aboriginal children there and mixed race children. But you know, the average person may not appreciate that the forced removal of children was something that happened in colonial America. It happened in California during the gold rush there. It happened in Canada with their residential schools. And Canada's only now sort of really delving into that history and coming to terms with it. And it's horrific, right? You know, these boarding schools where Canadian Indian children were taken from their families and taken to. I mean, the abuse that went on there, you know, and they're finding like mass graves and all these sorts of things. It happened in South America, in Argentina. We know it happened in parts of the Middle East. It happened during the Armenian genocide that the Turks inflicted in the early 20th century. And you know, it was interestingly with the Nazis in their hatred for the Jews, they actually eliminated children to the same extent as their parents. They were more sort of obsessed with the notion that race resided in the blood. So it didn't matter if you were a child. If you're a Jewish child, you were as kind of despised as a Jewish adult. But even more recently, we've seen similar kind of acts of removing children, even in the war between Russia and Ukraine. It's happening in parts of Western China with a Muslim minority that lives in Western China. So it's a sad and tragic history, but it's something that is still actually with us and still happening to the present day. And it's still very much underpinned by the same sort of ideology, right? That childhood is a time in which you can change the individual into something that is more desirable for whoever is in power. And like I said, it's sadly still happening to this day.
It's funny that, you know, sort of like you mentioned that the tools that were meant to establish and build the empire ultimately dismantled it in the form of literacy.
Yeah.
And it's crazy how, you know, tools such as knowledge, that knowledge can be objective, but it can be used to subjective, you know, ends.
Yeah.
For example, this thing with childhood, you know.
Yeah.
The more we learn about childhood, the more we know as parents that I'm not a parent, but I'm
Sure.
speaking.
Me neither.
I'm speaking on behalf of, you know,
Yep.
parents. But child psychology tells us that, you know, there are certain influences that a child internalizes that are gonna, you know, define their adulthood, so to speak.
Absolutely.
So, you know, we with that information, a person who seeks, you know, positive ends would then use that to nurture their child to be the best version of themselves. But that information, that objective information, can also be used to different ends, such as with the indoctrination of children.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely, and that, you know, that's the unfortunate reality when it comes to knowledge. You know, knowledge is power, but the way in which that power manifests is not always necessarily good, right? Knowledge can be deployed for purposes that we would define as good, and I think, I mean, maybe I'm an idealist, but I subscribe to the notion, however naively, that there's sort of a universal kind of notion of good, you know, and bad. I think if whatever you're doing is kind of clearly inflicting harm on people, I think that's bad, right? But knowledge can be used for purposes that can create a lot of chaos and can inflict a lot of harm on a lot of people. As you said, you know, just the notion of childhood. You know, in the early 19th century, these ideas of childhood are very much kind of in circulation and evolving, that it is this distinct time in an individual's life where you can kind of shape them and socialize them. And it's really out of that you then get eventually, you know, the formal education system that we now have, right? It comes a bit later, but these are the kind of the origins of it. Because around the early 19th century, when of course Britain is still very much in its kind of industrial revolution, child labor was just something that was taken for granted. You know, as soon as you could carry a shovel and you could, you know, walk, you were put to work. You know, children were chimney sweepers, children worked in mines and so on. But we start to see from the early 19th century, the early 1800s, a series of laws kind of being introduced in Britain that then start to deal with child labor. And to actually know it's not in the best interests of children to be working. They need to be educated. They need to be socialized. And as I said, out of that, you get kind of formal state education eventually. And these ideas also then start to make their way to the colonies as well. Sometimes through missionaries or sometimes through publications and so on, and they start to find particular expression in the colonies as well. But yeah, so childhood as a concept is something that I think today is for the most part kind of deployed for good, deployed as an argument to say that's a time where you want to nurture, where you want to provide education. But in other circumstances, as I've indicated, it's sometimes used as a justification for removing children from their communities in these processes that are genocidal or whatever it may be.
Yeah, you spoke a bit earlier on how the I don't know whether it was the imperial state or the local settlers framed the child confiscations as you term it. They sort of framed it as being in the best interest of the children due to the incapacity of the adults to take care of the children. Yeah, and that sort of sheds a light on the paternalistic attitude of the settlers and how a lot of adults were infantilized well into their adulthood.
Absolutely,
Shed a light on that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's a very important point that you raise. It was typical in colonial context for the colonizers to project the colonized in infantilized ways that they couldn't possibly know what was in their best interests, and so we would determine that for them, right? And it's kind of the height of it's of course racist. It's deeply paternalistic. It's dehumanizing. But settler colonialism, sort of, at least in the Cape Colony, in that context, kind of created the conditions where it did become very difficult for San parents to look after their children, right? Because you've been dispossessed of your land, you're living a very precarious existence, you are kind of actively hated, and there's kind of efforts to eradicate you. You don't have access to the same sort of natural resources, food supplies, water supplies that perhaps previous generations had. So these circumstances were created by settler colonialism, but then were kind of in turn used as a justification for removing San children because their parents can't look after them, so it's better that they then become kind of indentured laborers in settler households where they can at least be taken care of. So it's deeply duplicitous. It's it's an inherently kind of flawed idea, but that was fairly typical of these sorts of colonial contexts. Wherever you have a power dynamic where you've got one group kind of imposing itself on another, that group will always find the justifications it needs to sort of, justify its actions.
How does the London Missionary Society come into play here in terms of sort of, how can I say, rectifying some of those inconsistencies?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because missionaries are also by their nature sort of quite complicated, right? Are they a force for good? Are they a force for bad? I suppose and a lot of this depends on our own personal views and bias and so on, And I try not to in my work, I think when a discussion like this is slightly different. I think when you're writing something for publication, you try and be less emotional. Perhaps you try to not necessarily make such big judgment calls as such. So it's like try and understand these people in terms of what they believed they were doing, and then what were the consequences and effects of that, even if those were unintended. So in the Cape context, the London Missionary Society becomes quite sort of politically involved, especially around the 1820s, 1830s. The missionaries held a fair degree of influence over the British imperial government, and they campaigned for better working conditions for Khoesan, for instance. The superintendent of the London Missionary Society in the Cape Colony at that time was a man by the name of John Phillip, and he wrote quite extensively trying to bring to light the very negative, detrimental effects of settler colonialism on the indigenous peoples of Southern Africa. And so he's quite an interesting figure in himself. He's sort of ahead of his time in that sense. But, again, missionaries were not all the same. Some missionaries were deeply racist, deeply paternalistic, like very authoritarian, But others were somewhat different. They were a bit more kind of humanitarian. They were, of course, concerned with the spiritual lives of their congregants and concerned that they were provided education and they were given kind of better means of livelihood and that sort of thing. And so the missionaries definitely provide kind of some of the tools like literacy that enable some indigenous peoples in Southern Africa to resist colonialism in ways that were not necessarily violent. And of course, remember, this tradition that we see kind of emerging, the humanitarian tradition, largely driven by missionaries working amongst, say, Khoesan in the early 19th century Cape Colony, it carries on through. You eventually find it, of course, in the Eastern Cape missions amongst the Xhosa, and then eventually further, in the South African interior, and I won't say it's a straight line, but there's maybe a zigzag line to eventually the founding of the South African Natives National Congress, which of course was the precursor to the African National Congress, where its original leadership were all sort of mission educated, right? And then from there, eventually you get what we know as liberation theology. We were talking about how knowledge can be used for different purposes. Well, we know that Christianity has been used as a means of oppression, and it's been used as a means of liberation, depending on who is sort of deploying it for what purposes. But when certain colonized peoples read things like, all are created equal in the sight of God, or kind of heard that message in a sermon and took it to heart, said, but hang on, that doesn't quite square with our experience of being a colonized people. We know that liberation theology played a very important role in shaping the early work of, for instance, the African National Congress. And a lot of its, as I said, a lot of its early leadership was mission educated, were reverends. Of course, the first president of the ANC, John Dube, was a reverend. And there were other presidents subsequent to that were also reverends. It's only around the time of the Second World War, sort of mid-1940s, when communism becomes another force for promoting liberation amongst colonized peoples, that it starts to resonate, especially with the younger generation in particular the ANC, right? Yeah. And then you have the formation of the ANC Youth League in the mid-1940s, and these two kind of thrusts sort of work together in terms of shaping how people how resisted, of course, by the mid-1950s, how they resisted apartheid. But there is, like I said, there's this, I won't call it a straight line, because I never think history is that simple and straightforward, but there's certainly a zigzag line that connects the early work of the missionaries at the Cape Colony in the early 19th century right through to the struggle against apartheid in the 20th century.
So basically, like, because there were arguments again of how literacy, which of course is a way to improve Christian imperial subjecthood in terms of the citizens.
Yeah, absolutely.
Also ultimately dismantle. That was a very accurate statement on the part of the people who were in opposition to that.
Yeah, no, indeed. I mean, it's why we still put such an emphasis on literacy today. We know that it opens up so many possibilities for the individual in terms of their personal growth and self-identity and what they'll be capable of one day. So if you then kind of extrapolate that to a group of people, it definitely, like I said earlier, it sort of shifted the terrain. Right? That's why one of the most significant inventions in the history of the world was the invention of the printing press. And we know that without the invention of the printing press, one wouldn't have had, for instance, the Protestant Reformation. And what underpinned the Protestant Reformation was, again, this idea of the personal relationship between the individual and God through Scripture. And that's the influence that these missionaries coming from Europe to Africa, to South Africa, sort of bring with them. So yeah, once history's intriguing in so many ways because you can zone in to these very kind of particular moments and uncover the sort of the intricacies and complexities of the moment, but then you can also kind of zoom out and see the broader kind of arcs of history and how these significant kind of moments and processes are connected from one kind of age to the other. So so that's what keeps me coming back to it, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So basically, history is inexhaustible.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if the sources allow, right? Sources are often a big challenge. A lot of the work that I've done, I've had to be very circumspect about the sources I'm using, because oftentimes it's not necessarily Khoesan individuals who are writing. That does exist. It does exist, but you've really got to go looking for it. But yeah, as soon as you're working on parts of the past that happened quite some time ago, certainly before the living memory of anyone alive now, you depend on the quality and the preservation of the sources. Fortunately, a lot of the sources that reveal some of this history of the Cape Colony and the Cape Khoesan are still quite well preserved. And it's a matter of having the time, of course, then to also access them and sit down with them and wade through them. And one collection of sources that, of course, I used extensively were the missionary records. So one thing why I appreciate missionaries as a historian is because they were for the most part, they were quite diligent in keeping records. They were often required by their missionary societies to send quite detailed reports on a regular basis. So how many people did you convert in the last 3 months, or at least did you think you converted, and they would keep records about kind of weather, because oftentimes they had to try and create a self-sustaining mission, so you'd have to kind of build some dwellings and plant some crops and kind of attract people to come and stay. They build a church, of course, have services, report on the attendance at those services, are people like being sincere, in their worship and in their prayer. And so they're making these kind of judgment calls. And they're also, of course, commenting on these indigenous peoples that they're interacting with. Sometimes not particularly well, or you also have to kind of sift through the deep cultural bias and paternalism and so on. But there's still, if you read it with a critical eye, there's still a lot there that you can extract from those sorts of sources to tell this sort of history. And I'm aware of some scholars that are working on things like climate change that have used missionary records because the missionaries were so diligent in keeping records of things like rainfall and weather patterns and so on. So even climate scientists have been able to go back to those sorts of sources to use them to see, oh, okay, well, there was a drought in this particular year and it broke in that particular year, and so missionary sources are this kind of incredibly rich body of material that not only historians but other scholars can use.
Wow. Could you elaborate? And you wrote a paper on this, a very well-written paper, if I do say so myself.
Thank you.
On settler-initiated violence. Please just explain to the audience the dynamics that were at play there.
Yeah, so I think I came at that paper from the point of view of also wanting to tell the history of the forced removal of San children.
Yeah.
And I kind of made the point, again, from also having read the literature of some other scholars, Muhammad Adakari in particular, just to mention him again and the work that he's done, that in fact, in the Cape Colony at least, a lot of the initiative to take possession of land and to dispossess indigenous peoples and to forcibly remove their children was taken by settlers, in a way that from the outset wasn't necessarily completely orchestrated. It was sometimes quite sort of ad hoc, and then over time becomes more systematic. And in the case of the forced removal of San children, settlers were doing that for a long time before the British imperial government comes along and then tries to regulate it. Interestingly, they don't ban it or try and make it illegal. They just try to regulate it. They basically wanted to ensure that San children weren't being enslaved, although, one could argue that that is effectively what was happening, and it's kind of just semantics, right? But they didn't want them to be enslaved, and they wanted them to be kind of placed in settler households where they would be clothed and they would be kind of looked after, whereas more often than not, of course, from the point of view of the settler household, they just wanted laborers, right? Pliable laborers. So these were the sorts of ideas that then influenced a kind of legal framework from coming into effect. But in actual fact, you've had civilian initiative driving these processes, perhaps outside of the scope of any kind of state apparatus or state infrastructure for many, many years. I think it's useful to recognize that, because it shows how, at least initially, colonialism wasn't necessarily as well organized and as orchestrated as we sometimes think it was. Certainly in the late 18th century, early 19th century.
Yeah, because you also made this point in the paper that a lot of scholarship or historical texts focus on the role of the government in colonization.
Yeah, the role of the government in colonization, and especially the role of if you consider genocide studies, especially the role of government in that. And I think the argument there, which I tend to agree with, is that for kind of more recent generations, if you talk about genocide, people typically think of the Holocaust of the Jews during the Second World War by the Nazis, Jews and Gypsies and other minorities, of course. It's important to recognize that it wasn't only Jews, although Jews were, of course, the primary target. And, the Nazis approached the Holocaust in a very methodical, almost kind of industrial way. Mass deportation of people to death camps where they are kind of killed en masse, Genocide doesn't always unfold like that. And what some of the research that we've been doing, myself and some other scholars, certainly in colonial contexts, kind of further back in time, the state didn't always necessarily have the initial role or even a driving role in the way in which some of these genocidal processes unfolded.
Yeah. I mean, in your estimation, we sort of talked about the rationale behind the child confiscations, which is that the San adults didn't have the capacity to take proper care of the children, and I think that sort of ties into the conceptualization that European settlers just had of settlers in general.
Absolutely.
Which was one of infant. The way I sort of thought of infantilization the other day is sort of like we're all living together, right? And in terms of the San children that come to be adults, we're all living together, and we're basically the same age now, and we're having conversations, But this person is sitting here, which is the oppressed. They're sitting here, the infantilized. They're sitting here and they're listening to us speak. And they're just, looking and they sort of can't make sense of what's being said. It's almost like we're speaking a foreign language, even though, we're sort of speaking the exact same language. And that sort of, took me to some of the pain that process could have. I just thought of myself, just listening to people who are speaking a foreign language, that which I can't understand. That's a very frustrating experience. Now, imagining my oppressors being, or my tormentors rather, being the people who are communicating in a way that I can't see, mostly due to the fact that I was taken as a child, and this is how I was socialized as a slave, basically.
No, indeed.
Yeah. So what would you say are some of the because now the children that are being taken are obviously being intentionally separated from their communities.
Right. Yeah.
And they have to become adults eventually.
Yeah.
And
Indeed.
probably they have to have kids of their own, and they have to have kids and so on.
Mm.
What would you say are some of the, and this, just to make this a fair question, I mean, in your estimation,
Yeah.
are some of the long-term effects of such infantilization, and
Yeah.
are some of these dynamics still at play today in modern South Africa?
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question. It's a disturbing question, right? Because it touches on something that is, it's deeply troubling. One has to consider when children are removed from their communities deliberately and for sustained periods of time, the intention there is to create a cultural rupture, a cultural break, essentially, because you're trying to make these children into something else. What they were was problematic and not desirable in terms of the kind of the colonial thinking and the colonial apparatus. And you're wanting to make them into something else. And for the most part, that happens, right? The children lose these connections with their families, and in the process with their cultural identity. We know that language is a fundamental aspect of our cultural identities, so that's getting lost as well. So we know that many Khoesan languages have been lost over the course of time. Now, that cultural rupture is it's kind of obvious when you've got children being removed from their communities, right? One can appreciate that because it's so apparent, but colonialism brings about these conditions in other ways as well. And those are the deeply troubling legacies that have lasted long beyond the end of colonialism, where once a language is lost, it's lost. There's no real way of really getting it back. We know of some Khoesan communities where there's just a handful of people left speaking a particular dialect, and chances are once they pass on, that language too will die. We know the extinction of languages is something that is happening quite regularly in the modern world as well. And so there's these kind of forces that are working in different ways that bring about these conditions. One of the articles that I wrote, I used for the title a quote. It was said by a Khoesan woman to a researcher in kind of the 1860s. He was interviewing Khoesan people, and he collected her life story. And this particular researcher had an interest in San rock art, and he sort of asked her about it. And her response was, we do not know who painted our pictures. So that, already in the 1860s, it was apparent, it was this grown Khoesan woman who was aware of the fact that the rock art that she might have seen in her lifetime, because she was clearly aware of it, was painted by her forebears, but she didn't know what it meant. And we know that rock art is deeply symbolic. It's narrative based. It's storytelling. It's not just pictures on a cave wall, right? But I think even the most distinguished rock art specialist would acknowledge that what we think we know about rock art today is a lot of it is kind of educated guesswork, right? And it's probably a lot more deeper and symbolic than even we appreciate. And it's because of these generational ruptures that have happened. So was someone in the 1860s already, a Khoesan woman, who didn't know what the rock art meant and wasn't even sure, kind of had a sense that, yes, people I'm descended from created this, but we do not know who they were. We do not know who painted our pictures. And so that line kind of really sort of struck me as deeply sad,
Yeah.
And then, if you bring it kind of closer to the present day, if you create this sense of identity crisis within people as a collective, that's going to have kind of serious social consequences, right? And it speaks to a lot of the very serious social issues we have in South Africa today, especially, if you look at subsequent to the history that we're talking about, if you come into the 20th century, you've got, the forced removals of apartheid, for instance, where people are uprooted from their neighborhoods and dumped in other places. And you think of the Cape Flats and still to this day, the challenges there around things like, abuse, substance abuse, and just, the social issues, the gang violence and so on. These are all sort of products of this very problematic history in where these ruptures have been created between people and their histories and their identities. And sadly, that's the kind of the enduring legacy of a lot of this, of colonialism and of apartheid. And some of it is kind of gone forever, right? Sadly. Some of it may be uncovered again and reclaimed, perhaps. And it's probably little surprise that we see today that there are some Khoesan communities that are trying to reclaim an identity sort of from before, right? From before European colonialism. They're sort of harking back. Sometimes it's nostalgic. It may not necessarily be so kind of historically accurate, but I understand it, right? I understand it because it's this kind of sense of who we are, what we maybe what could have been had it not been for, and so the motives there I think are clear, are understandable. How they manifest, if they start to manifest in ways that are nationalistic or that become, possibly disruptive or, then that's a whole another issue. But I think one can certainly understand why there are these kind of First Nations movements, not just in South Africa, all over the world really, because we're in a moment, I think, where First Nations, Indigenous peoples are wanting to reclaim a space, after the trauma of the last couple of 100 years.
Yeah, wow, that's very significant. That's very significant. I mean, it's very true that, and I feel like just to start off the point that you made of the Khoesan lady in the 1860s,
Yeah.
and she was already starting to feel those the legacy of erasure.
Yeah, exactly. Cultural erasure. Yeah.
Yeah, cultural erasure. And I remember, I mean, I could be wrong here. Maybe I'm mixing things up, but you sort of drew parallels or even framed the changing of Khoesan, how can I say, identities into speaking English and
Afrikaans, of course.
Afrikaans and acclimatizing to the settler ways. You sort of framed that as a form of genocide.
Yeah, well, yeah. So, not all genocide scholars necessarily buy into this, but I think what we recognize is that the erasure of a people's identity can happen in different ways, and it can happen in different ways simultaneously. So I think it's important to stress that genocide would typically involve kind of mass killing of a particular group of people. But coupled with that, the survivors would be pressurized to acculturate, to assimilate, to become different so that they are not perceived as threats, are not perceived as undesirable, and so therefore ought to be exterminated. But that's cultural erasure as well. And you sort of touching on the erasure of an identity of a people over time. Sometimes it can be quite abrupt. There can be moments of abruptness. Sometimes it happens over longer periods of time. And I've written about Khoesan assimilation. We spoke about it at sort of the beginning of this discussion. You have to be conscious of the fact that yes, these people are responding, are changing, and one can kind of appreciate that on its own terms. It's these kind of acts of agency. It's sometimes sort of inspiring to see how people dealt with these very oppressive circumstances. But one must not lose sight of the fact that assimilation is in itself kind of an act of desperation. because how else is one supposed to survive?
Yeah.
So and like we've touched on now, the long-term effects of that can be deeply problematic and speak to a lot of the social issues that a lot of post-colonies have and in all likelihood will continue to have. But like I said, there's definitely something happening, right? Currently, there's one thinks of First Nation movements, greater recognition than was the case some years ago. It's still got a long way to go, but I think unless First Nations and First Nation descendants drive it, then it's just going to be more of the same, right? It's really got to come from these communities in terms of the types of change that they want to see, the types of recognition they want to see. But the fact of the matter is also, we live in an age where the world is globalized. And we're all kind of in some way or other cultural products of a globalized world. And if you want to hark back to this idea that we need to try and be something from years ago that was pure, that's going to be a problem. Because I have concerns about the kind of world that will create. I think that will create a more divided world. So it's how do you create a balance between recognizing the histories and generational trauma of communities that have suffered deeply as a result of processes like colonialism and apartheid and so on. But how do you also continue to live in a globalized world in which we are all cultural products of numerous different influences? And I think the world is in a moment where we are kind of grappling with that as well. And history is important, right? Because history, people need to kind of be made aware of the fact that sometimes what current political leaders are saying doesn't hold water when you actually look at the history, and that what they're doing could be possibly quite divisive, and then we could kind of learn histories of the past where these things have been attempted in the past. As soon as someone, for me, like as soon as a politician starts talking about a pure race, I sort of check out, because that's a flawed idea, right? And it's been used time and time again to cause so much havoc in so many parts of the world. So that immediately for me is a red flag. As soon as people talk about things like, oh, we want to, well, to use a phrase we hear quite often these days in the news, at least, like make America great again, right? Yeah. It's this harking back to this imagined past where everything was perfect, and then we allowed immigrants in, and now everything's gone bad. Yeah. That's deeply problematic. That's a red flag. If someone is espousing that sort of ideology, it's a problem. It's divisive. It's going to lead to conflict. It's going to lead to confrontation. And the history shows us that. Those are the lessons that we can draw from the past. So yeah, that's, like I said, that's what keeps me coming back to it in a sense. But there's these moments currently which have these deep historical resonances, and we need to be kind of awake to that, and alert to that.
Oh, Professor Dr. McDonald, that was
Dr. McDonald.
Dr. McDonald, that was very impactful. And I sort of remember here, and I think it would be fair to mention that we were discussing something with Professor Christian Williams, and we actually mentioned your work, specifically that part where that you actually told the story of how literacy and colonialism intersected, and that was a powerful point, and I did mention it to him.
Okay.
And it's fair to mention him because our viewers would also maybe want to refer to that episode as well, because
Absolutely,
he also mentions this thing that you're mentioning of not viewing the Merry Africa approach and sort of not viewing things like that, and sort of charting a path to the future as opposed to looking at the past with rose-colored eyes.
Absolutely, rose-tinted glasses.
Yeah, rose-tinted glasses, yeah.
Well, no, I'm pleased you mentioned that. I know Professor Williams well, and I have huge admiration for the work that he does. I think he's a brilliant scholar. Of course, he's done a lot of work on Namibia Namibian history. Yeah, I mean, I can't agree with him more. You know, we have to be careful of this idea that pre-colonial Africa was, you know, all kumbaya and everybody kind of got along, and because that's just not true, right?
Yeah.
You know, Africa was a dynamic place where there were different centers of power, and those centers of power kind of rose and then fell, and there was conflict between different groups, and so yeah, as soon as someone talks in these terms about, you know, this romanticized past which we need to get back to, you just know that probably the motives there are not particularly good or genuine. And it's actually just it's kind of rhetoric. It doesn't hold water when you put it alongside the historical record.
Yeah.
Like I said, it's about striking a balance between appreciating cultural diversity, trying to perhaps reclaim some cultural markers of identity that have been lost. I spoke to you before when we were just chatting about kind of the work that the University of the Free State's doing around you know, the publication of literature, of poetry in indigenous African languages in a bid to promote indigenous African languages. And that's all important and valuable work, but it's done in balance with the fact that we are a diverse society. And as much as we want to promote you know, perhaps the rebuilding of cultures or the promotion of cultural diversity and cultural markers of identity, that we also do that in a way that still values cultural diversity as well.
Yeah. Thank you very much for those points. And just for the audience here, as we're drawing to a close here, I just want to appreciate you, Dr. McDonald, for your laser focus, because like unlike other times, you know, we have a fact has been brought to our attention that we're sharing a studio space, and we were just listening to rock. We had the pleasure of listening to rock and roll throughout this whole conversation.
It was quite interesting to have that in the background, I'm not going to lie. But, but it kind of added something. It was all good. Yeah, I think the conversation's been so great, and thank you for your questions that I was able to keep focus.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I found myself just like, you know, trying to rock out. I was about to walk out here and rock out.
In fact, I did, when it first started, I sort of looked at you and I thought, what's happening? And I could see you like, we just continuing. And I thought, okay, no, that's great. I'm good to go.
Yeah.
So thank you for that.
Thank you again for joining us, Dr. McDonald.
Great, thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Mzansi, for joining us in the Social Justice Lab, where, you know, it may seem like it's about a lot of things, but we assure you, it's just society.